where common sense meets enlightenment. Conversations around mind, body, and spirit. Each month, a group of wellness thought leaders assemble to discuss topics like rage, wisdom in the 21st century, our mental chatter, and how to build healthy relationships.
Good evening, wisdom seekers. You're listening to the Wisdom Track podcast from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAAM for short. You can find us over at angermanage.co.uk. You can also subscribe right now to the Wisdom Track podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Buzzsprout, and you can find us over on YouTube as well. Just search for the Wisdom Track podcast. My name's Steve Beale. I'm an in-house writer and presenter for BAAM. And today I'm introducing Mike Fisher and Craig Snake Bloomstrand talk about mentoring the inner child. Our next podcast following this one is scheduled for July the 19th, date for your diary. That's actually a Monday evening where we're talking about the power of no. That's especially for those of us who have trouble saying no to anything. I know I'm one of those, and I'll certainly be there. But today we are talking about the inner child. And in psychology, we often look at childhood as where issues begin, and that's hardly incorrect. But there are actually a lot of positives we can gain, by re-establishing a relationship with our inner child. As we grow up, sometimes we decide to suppress or neglect aspects of our core personality that in adulthood, it can be very energizing to reconnect with, especially in terms of consolidating our core identities and learning about our real selves. If you really want to get to know your inner child, in September 2021, so just a little bit later this year, Mike and Snake are holding a special 4-part workshop on the subject. It's every Thursday, starting on the 9th of September for 3 hours each evening. And you can find more details over at angermanage.co.uk. Just log on and you can't miss it. You can start making friends with your inner child right now. Mike and Snake are going to make the introductions. Here they are.
Here and glad to dig into this topic. Michael and I have had several conversations around it, and I've spent a certain amount of headspace trying to write about it. And I think the impetus for the conversation we're going to have today is both Mike and I do coaching and mentoring and educating in different ways. And it seems so much of the self-discovery work that helps people get clear about their preferences and who they are cycles back to early childhood development. And I'm not real big on putting all the blame there, but it's a great place to go mining for a lot of the different things that shaped our character. So we're going to present it in a little different way and look at some aspects of it that have occurred to us, but haven't necessarily been out there in general knowledge. So I'm looking forward to going forward. It's I've spent the last 2 weeks with 3-year-old and 7-year-old grandsons up in the woods, and so I'm up close and personal with inner child at the moment. I have one grandson who's a negotiator and another one who's just real eager to have a good time. And inner child, I can see it developing in them, and we're all in for it. So I'll check in with that.
Do you want to give us a little bit of your background as well, Snake? I think people will be quite curious to know a little bit more about your background and your history.
Yeah, I started working about 30 years ago. I got introduced to the Mankind Project and came into it when it was just beginning. And so I've led workshops for men around the world, worked with men and women in co-gender work, been real involved in prison programs out at Folsom Prison and working with military, specifically special forces, recently retired and making the transition back to civilian life. So my interest is not as a therapist or as an academic, but as a field worker. And I think that's enough.
Yeah, I love it when you describe yourself as a field worker, like a field marshal.
I think it's more compulsive, creative, and curious more than anything else.
Well, thank you. So, folks, if you want to read, if you haven't already read Snake's blog on the inner child piece, just go to our site. It's there. It's a fantastic piece, and it truly is inspirational. And Snake is a brilliant, brilliant wordsmith as well. So he does quite a lot of our blog writing for these wisdom track programs. For those of you who know me, I don't really have to kind of give you my background again, but those who don't know me, I've been in the field of personal and professional development for the last 34 years. I'm very different to Snake in the respect that I'm like deep into like theory and modularity and, you know, mentioning books and mentioning names of many of my mentors. And so there's a nice mix between Snake's storytelling and his own life experience and my life experience storytelling, but also like, instead of just talking about the stuff, how does it actually apply in our lives and how can we find a way of integrating and embodying a lot of what it is that I teach. And what I'm excited about this is that this is the first time we're presenting, no, this is the second time we're presenting the conversation, and then we go on from the conversation to the actual workshop. The last one we did was the Tyranny of Perfection, and I know there are a couple of you here who did the 4-week program on Tyranny of Perfection. I'm hoping that you'll also be here for the Inner Child program in September. I don't think I need to say more than that at this point. However, I do want to talk about how we got involved in having the conversation. I like to think about different themes, and a lot of the themes that I like to think about are directly linked to the anger management programs that I and my team deliver. And inner child work, we just touch on. We don't go into any depth about inner child work. However, it is such a vast subject, and it is such a rich subject. And there are so many different theoretical constructs. Let me start again. There are so many different theoretical constructions associated with inner child work. And what I've done over the past, I think, 30 years is kind of pull some of those strands together and give it my own version of inner child work. However, the one that I'm most interested in at the moment is internal family systems, which is that we don't just have a child inside of us, we have a whole family inside of us, and we call them, and they're represented by what we call parts, different parts of us. Most of the parts that we have inside of us are what we call managers and protectors. The problem with the child part of us, he or she's the part that we need to manage and we need to protect, because they don't have the skills that we have as mature adults or even as teenagers or young adults. So those are the parts that tend to play up. In the conversation that Snake and I had recently, we, through what Snake sparked off in me, was this idea of the child part needs to be disciplined. They need discipline, which of course I agree with what Snake said. However, when I think about how many people I've worked with and the kind of discipline they experience was more like abuse. It wasn't discipline. So the conversation started with by saying, okay, well, I take your point, Snake. I think it's a valid point, but we also have to be aware that discipline can also be defined by many people, certainly many people in my client group, who experience it as abuse as opposed to constructive and helpful discipline. So that's where we started the conversation. We then unpacked it and looked at it from the perspective of the ability to discern. And then we went deep into the conversation and we spoke about discretion. And then finally, we touched on this notion of discovery, self-discovery. And so we talk about the 3Ds, but we've just added another D. So in fact, Snake was suggesting earlier on, it's the inner child in 4D, which I kind of quite like. In fact, I think the inner child is more like in 6D. However, for this presentation, we really want to stick to the structure of discretion, being able to discern, discipline, and of course, discovery. Are there any questions before we move into the conversation or comments? I'm assuming most of you here don't know much about inner child work, but those of you who do know about inner child work, do you want to just say a little bit of how much you know about inner child work so at least Snake and I can get a handle on that?
My knowledge is very limited, Mike.
What about everyone else?
I heard Snake say that he plays with his grandchildren and he's very connected with his inner child, which is what I do once a week, is go and literally play with my granddaughter the whole day. So I really feel that it fuels me up, gives me energy to be playful. And that's it. That's all I know about it.
And of course, I'm imagining have fun.
Absolutely. It's a whole day fun.
Yeah. Cool.
I can talk about it from the context of art therapy and play therapy. With sound tray therapy, that's a great way to access the psychology, but also the child part of you. Also, drawing yourself as a child can help access really deep things, actually, that you wouldn't have thought about. Yeah, in the context of art.
Yeah, and children like to draw and paint.
Yeah.
Children like to play and have fun. And that's one of the ways they can do it. Yeah, cool. Anybody else?
Hi, Mike, it's Emily.
Hi.
So I've done, let me see, okay. So I'm working on inner child healing, actually. And I've done inter-family system, but at the moment I'm doing inner child healing. And it's really to go back and be able to meet this inner child, you know, and kind of reassuring this inner child every day and just kind of meeting them. And just make sure you're in the present while you are doing this exercise. Because like you say, as an adult, you've got all the resources to help this inner child to heal the past. So, I mean, personally is what I've been working on, etc., which is, it's a great experience. It's a hard one, but it's also,
Yes.
it's not the easiest journey, but.
I have to agree with you. It's certainly not the easiest journey.
But it does work, so it's very interesting.
Yes, especially when it comes to when you start to address the wounds of the child.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
the trauma of the child. Yeah.
And you can have some surprises, you know, you can find you back in some, I mean, personally, I find that the inner child and inter-family, you know, system, I think you need to be really ready for it to do it. And personally, I tried to work on it last year and I was not ready for it. It was too strong. And it took me a year to come back to it and be able actually to, because it was too powerful, basically, in terms of emotion, etc. So I think people who decide to go into inner child, I think people who decide into inner child needs to know that there's a big part of you who need to be ready and also be well, how do you say, or do it with a therapist, which can really help you through the process, you know?
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, so some of you have a sense of this inner child work. Some of you have experience, direct experience, and I'm assuming the rest of you are just curious and interested. And I'm hoping you recognize that you also have an inner child. The difference is that if we have to cut you open, it's just going to be blood and guts, but it's a psychological fact. So whatever you say this afternoon, guess what? That child part of you is listening acutely. Be careful what you say. You've been warned. And the reason I say that, and then I'm going to hand you over to Snake, the reason I say that, there is the most fantastic saying. See if you can wrap your head around this one. The child is the parent of the adult. The child is the parent of the adult. If you do not take care of the child part of you, the child part of you will bring you to your knees. And I'm not talking just metaphorically, physically as well. And some of you probably already know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. Over to you, Snake.
Yeah, I want to go back to your comments about discipline, because there's several different types of discipline. And the example that you used, Mike, was being disciplined by another, by a parent, by a coworker, by someone else, being disciplined. And actually, I'd like to frame that slightly different in that this is the discipline to make change within your own mindset, to make change within your own behavior, and to be disciplined, not necessarily rigid and certainly forgiving, but disciplined in a commitment to learn more of where you came from and how you can best apply that going forward. I think each of the different D words that we came up with, and the list seems to continue growing, follow a trajectory, particularly doing workshops like Michael and I do, or coaching. There is a discovery process of, maybe it begins with anxiety, things not working, some kind of trauma or tragedy in life that sets you back and makes you reassess in some way. Why do I keep repeating this pattern, or this really isn't working? And to look back not only into the past, but present behaviors and examining them. What we hope to do with that is to develop some discernment that grows beyond what we may have picked up as children, to integrate the child and the adult in our decision-making process and our discernment. The discipline is to stay the course, to be forgiving, to be open. Some of the things that I picked up in childhood really didn't serve me, yet there's a selfish part of me that wanted to cling to them anyway because they were familiar. And another one is to be determined. 30 years ago, when I started really looking at myself, it took a lot of determination. Things weren't working well in my life. I knew I needed to make change. And the whole concept of changing in any way, shape, or form was foreign. I just kind of followed my nose through life up to that point in time, and had no concept that I could actually shape it in different ways. But an even bigger part of this conversation is not only the self-discovery, the personal growth work that goes along, and what a resource the inner child can be in interpreting that, but also that this process matures us as human beings. And I think there's certain vantage points that no way could we hold as children that we can hold as adults. And a lot of our discretion is formed out of the alliance between the child and the parent. So for instance, something like discipline that I'm sensitive around, because like Mike, I've seen so many people damaged in their childhood by overly strict disciplinarians. And oftentimes they tend to be much the same in parenting themselves. They tend to be overly strict and unforgiving with themselves based on their upbringing, simply because it's familiar. And so I want to let a little air out of that balloon. And it's not all kumbaya. Certainly there are revelations that come up that plague people through their entire life, particularly like trauma survivors. It's not like you can just change your mindset and the trauma goes away. But over time, being able to recognize the emotional response informs our decisions going forward. So all of that is food for thought and food for discussion. But I want to focus less on the damage caused to children and more the work that we can do as adults to integrate what our biography says about us and what our current day actions as adults say about us, and clearly making decisions around that to the best of our ability. So I'll pause there. I have a lot of coffee in me and a lot big speech of words this morning.
Yeah, and keeping in mind that Snake is in Minneapolis and I'm in Santander in Spain. So we're in two very different timelines. I'm curious, did anybody want to respond to what Snake has been saying? Or do you have any questions about what he's just been saying? Or even to possibly develop on what he's just been saying?
For me, there are patterns in my childhood that reflect in how I approach parenting. I mean, I've got 3 kids, 18 years difference between the second and the third one. And for me, I mean, that is almost a generational gap. I know my parenting is very different with the third child versus the first and second, where I probably displayed a lot of that behavior from my parents. And, you know, I don't know if the expression is inherited, you know, learned, experienced. And yeah, with number 3, I've been very consciously trying to change that approach.
So Mark, just let me just check out something with you. Are you aware of the child part of you?
No, I don't think I am, which is why I was intrigued to consider this course. But I can certainly resonate with Snake's position here.
Cool. So anybody else want to comment? So let me go back in time. I was first introduced to inner child work. It was 33 years ago. I started training in psychotherapy 34 years ago. And I was in a relationship with a woman who all I can say to you, I was just all over the show and I was extremely damaged. It was my first year of training as a psychotherapist, and it was a very intense program. And I didn't do very well with conflict. And I remember very clearly, in fact, and now I'm going back to 33 years ago, because I remember the first therapist I worked with and the second therapist I worked with. But when I separated from her, I didn't fall apart. And then I tried to make up with her. And what happened was she said no, she didn't want to be with me. And I literally fell apart. And at that point, I was working with a therapist who introduced me to inner child work. And what I discovered in that phase of my life is that, one, I had no idea that I had a child part. The idea of inner child work was completely and utterly foreign to me. 2 was, because I had no idea that there was a child part, you can imagine it was a shock to even discover that. And then, of course, when it came to doing some of the inner child work, then what I discovered is the child part of me didn't trust me, simply because, 1, I didn't even know existed, and 2 is because I had neglected him. And it was the child part of me that fell apart because he was so attached to and attracted to this particular girlfriend. And when she said no, she didn't want to be with me, I completely collapsed. I spiraled out of control. I was completely bereft and heartbroken. and absolutely traumatized. And that was the start of my journey. So what I had to do, I had to develop a relationship. And because I didn't have the most exciting childhood in the world, and because my parents' parenting skills were about zero, the idea of beginning the process of parenting or reparenting myself was a very, very new experience, and also a very, very new discovery. And so what I had to do, one was to read as much as I could on the subject, and two was to develop a relationship. But just coming back to two comments that are important in what you said, Snake. The one was with regards to discipline, what I had to train myself to do to the child part of me was to learn how to reassure that part. The adult was as functioning as I possibly could be, but the child part of me was deeply, deeply insecure. So I really had to start the process of building a relationship by having a conversation. And I'm talking about a conversation, the kind of conversation you would have a child. But I started by reassuring him, telling him it's going to be okay, telling him I got your back, telling him I recognize that you exist, and I'm going to protect you, and I'm going to take care of you. That was the starting point for me. Then the other thing that you said, Snake, which comes to mind, is when you were talking about discerning, which I think is such an important point that you made. The way I understood that was, and I've spoken about this before, what I have to do, or what I had to do, was to bring what I call the observer and my witness. And essentially what I'm talking about is being objective, having objectivity. And I can only do that is I look at it, if I looked at it from a different perspective, through the eyes of the observer or the witness. And it was the observer and the witness in me. There was, and I feel quite touched when I say this, but that was the part of me that guided the adult part of me to have a healthier relationship and a significant relationship with the child part of me. And that is the start, that was the start of my journey. And I can tell you what is most interesting today is that the conversation I have with him today is a much, much healthier conversation. So for example, what we were talking about earlier on, Snake, Claire and Diala, was the idea of being able to have fun, to be able to play. Now, in some methodology, they talk about the joyful child. In the TA model, the transactional analysis model, they talk about three aspects of the child. They talk about the joyful child, they talk about the wounded child, traumatized child, and they also talk about the child who adapted to the reality that he or she faced within the relationship or within the context of a dysfunctional family system. So for me, what was really interesting was, one was developing the relationship with that child part, developing a dialogue, getting him to trust me, reassuring him. That was the one part of it. The other part of it was giving him full attention whenever he needed it. So it was about building a conversation, building a dialogue, until he got to the point where he was able to trust me. Now, another term you used, Snake, was negotiation. So from my point of view, keeping in mind, the child part of me likes to have a lot of fun. So I had to negotiate with him. So the conversation I would have with him is like, okay, buddy, and his name is Mini Mike. Yeah, that's what I call him, Mini Mike. So I would have to have a conversation and say, look, okay, we've got, if I just take the reality that I'm faced with right now, I'm going to be working until the 27th of July. That's the date. He knows that date. 27th of July is my last working day. And then for the whole of August, guess what? We are going to have a shit load of fun. Everything's being switched off. We are going to play. That's it. There's no negotiable. It's non-negotiable, rather. And he likes to hear that because he can hang on until then. But that doesn't mean that I don't have as much fun as I like to have right now. So for example, he likes to play with clay. He likes to draw, he likes to paint, he likes to photograph. He likes to be creative, he likes to do things with his hands. That's not the adult part, that's the child part. The adult part of me is creating space for him to have fun, to play, to experience joy, lots of joy, because that's what he likes. In the same way as he likes surfing, in the same way as he likes mountains, in the same way as he likes fires and camping. I know exactly what he likes, so I negotiate with him and I build that internal dialogue to reassure him and say, these are the things that we are going to do. Now, if I don't do that in August, I'm going to have to deal with the consequences. And I know the consequences. I've experienced the consequences. He's brought me to my knees, not just once or twice. He's brought me to my knees many times. So he's a priority, and I got to make him a priority.
Let me ask you, Mike, and what's the consequence if you don't follow through on what you've agreed to with this other character?
Well,
what's the personal consequence for you?
Two things is that I end up getting depressed. And the second thing is I end up getting angry with myself because I don't want to neglect myself, and I don't want to neglect him. So those are the consequences. That's the fallout, depression and anger.
Yeah. I think it's important to note too that, you know, we're drawing some arbitrary lines between our childhood and our adulthood. And those lines need to blur to a certain degree because regardless of where we came from, we are who we are today. And to integrate both of those characters is the ultimate goal. But it's helpful to separate, to define out the different voices, at least initially. We're not children, we are adults. And not to be harsh about it, but I want clearer, cleaner access to the more innocent parts of myself, the more vulnerable parts, the joyful parts that in the name of becoming an adult, I jettisoned along the way. They've lived inside me and exhibited themselves in various different ways, but it is about integrating all of the different characters within ourselves, no matter where they came from. The inner child extends into my adolescence and being a teenager, crazy about cars. And it extends into my 20s and, you know, making a house and starting a career. There's many different phases and, you know, true. I heard someone mention before, I think Diala mentioned about, and I just blanked it out, the notion of healing. And I don't know if there's as much healing to be done or if we're using healing as a word to identify integrating all the different parts of ourselves. I'm glad for the scabs and the scars that I've got. They taught me something. And I don't want to repeat them. My discernment keeps me alert to that, but it's only by integrating and not splitting out the different characters too greatly. It's helpful to examine, but long-term integration is the goal in my mind.
So just to clarify, Snake, when you talk about integrating, is that the same as synthesizing? Is that?
No, it's more like having access to it. For instance, see if I can come up with a good example.
I can give you an example.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure how to integrate it, so maybe you can help me with that. So infidelity has been a big part of my family system growing up. It's affected me in a huge way, as well as my siblings. And it it disrupts me it disrupts my ability to trust in relationships. So I know that's the child part of me acting out. And I don't know how to go about integrating that, because I know I haven't integrated it if I'm fearful of that happening to me. So I know this is like my 11-year-old self finding messages and pictures on my dad's phone, you know, and it keeps on playing out, and me being absolutely mistrustful and paranoid, and, you know.
Yeah, no, I understand where you're coming from. I'm wondering too, is there a physical reaction that you have when these feelings come up? I mean, in your body, do you have a reaction when you're fearful around being abandoned?
Yeah, it's a shameful one.
Okay. And so I would imagine it's a feeling that's familiar.
Yeah.
That feeling of shame. And I use the word abandonment. That's not exactly what you're talking about. Let's stick with the infidelity piece, is that when that's a threat in your life, there's a physical reaction that you can feel that you identify as feeling much like shame, right?
Mm.
And so these types of things, these reactions, show up repeatedly in our lives. And that's the root cause of a pattern of not trusting or being cautious. And it's perfectly rational in having been hurt, you don't want it to repeat. And for me, those various triggers or emotional, physical reactions that I have cue me into the need to look at, now, is this simply a reaction or is it real? That's where we talk about discernment between an indigenous reaction that is old and familiar and the reality of today. And it's hard to make a break between those two. So what I'm advocating for is to acknowledge that you've been hurt by this infidelity is part of it. Changing the pattern by being aware of the reaction and where it came from. Infidelity in your family was not your fault. You didn't really contribute to it in any way, yet you carry the legacy of it forward. Once we're able to recognize both the emotional and the physical reaction, it doesn't solve the problem, but it works as a prompt. Say, well, wait a minute, this is familiar. And this is where I go with it. Much like Mike talked about, if he doesn't follow through with his commitment to the inner child, depression and anger are the result. It's like a cascade of different emotions that are very real and were very current and painful as a child, and take a different significance as an adult if we're mindful and familiar around them. The hurt is still there, the scar is still there, but what we do with it can change. Does that make sense?
In terms of integrating, yeah.
And it's not instant. That's why I use the word integration. We slowly integrate not only different behavior, but diminish the strength of that emotional reaction as we become more familiar with it. It's the emotions that hijack us and cause sudden anxiety or sudden shame at a real profound level that as we become more mindful of where it came from and how it affects us, it decreases in strength. And particularly with trauma, childhood trauma in particular, it's not an on-off switch. It takes time, digestion time, integration time, and self-reflection. to actually shift those patterns and decrease the strength of the emotions. And the benefit to it is that by taking some of that emotional reaction and redirecting it, what we discover is a greater range of emotion. One of the things that I see repeatedly is people who have suffered neglect as children oftentimes become very empathic as adults. And it's freeing up that neglect to a degree that they don't want anyone else to suffer from it, and increase their capacity for empathy and understanding. It takes different forms, but again, that's another level of that integration.
There's another way of looking at this. So let me just throw this out. There is a question, there are two questions that are worthwhile asking yourself, and you might want to do this as an exercise. The deepest desire of a child. What is your child's, the child parts of you, what is that child part's deepest desire?
To be lovable.
And what is that child's deepest fear?
To be unlovable.
And also to be rejected. Yeah. So there's something to be said, just coming back to what Snake was talking about, is about the integration. Is this, I think the word is the synthesis. And I don't know why I keep coming to the synthesis, but the integration of those two parts. So at the end of the day, one is I'm responsible to reassure the child that it's lovable. And I'm also responsible to reassure that the child will never be rejected and abandoned. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that is enough. But then you also might need to look at it from a slightly different perspective. You know, what is the child's greatest shame or deepest shame? What is the child's deepest joy? What is the child's deepest needs? And this is something that we'll look at when we deliver the inner child workshop. But I still think those are questions that you can ask yourself. But the two most important questions are, what does the child most desire? And you said it, to be loved. And the child's deepest fear is?
To be rejected. Is that, are we all different? I mean, there's no one.
Well, let's investigate it.
That was going to be my question. Is it a standard answer each person here? Is it as simple as that?
Well, I think different people will have different wounds. So
yeah.
We're just talking about Diala's wound, infidelity. Exposed to
and you know, I always am cautious to underline that we're not oversimplifying this. It's complicated and it's difficult and it takes time. And I can see on Diala's face, it touches her deeply emotionally. And so it's not to be underestimated, like we're looking for a silver bullet here. It's a process that takes time and self-discovery, and also huge amounts of forgiveness for who hurt us or was misguided. One of the most profound parts of this that I run into over and over again is the passive neglect that children suffer. Leaves a profound impact. You may sit there thinking, well, I wasn't abused. My parents were pretty decent to me. We made it through, and all of that's very true. But one thing I run into over and over again is no one was home. Like Michael said, my parents really didn't parent. And that's a passive form of neglect that has a profound impact when we become adults and learn to nurture our own children, or God forbid, learn to nurture ourselves. So basically, we're learning skills that, you know, maybe humanity is just developing at a deeper level to be able to do that self-discovery work. But it takes time. And, you know, I never want anyone to walk away feeling like, gee, I just don't get it. Welcome to the club. It takes months or years of feeling that way and repeating the same old patterns for it finally to go clunk. That moment of discovery of, oh, I see where I've had this wired wrong all these years. Then the patterns begin to change. But it takes a great deal of forgiveness and patience with self to do this type of work. And sometimes there's a big aha in there, and sometimes there's just greater understanding as to what shaped you. Either one is valuable.
So just let me come back to what I was saying, because I am curious about the comment you made, Diala. Does everybody else feel the same? The child's deepest desire and the child's deepest fear. Did you want to say something, Johnny?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I guess the child's deepest fear, it's as everyone's saying, it's not a general fear, because the child may be very frightened and terrified, but you may not know why that child is frightened, and it may not be about not being loved. It could be something else. But I guess until you can actually understand what it is and why that child is very frightened, you can see, you can hear it's frightened, but you don't know what's happened to it. And therefore the conversation you can have with it, I guess, is around reassuring it, but you don't know why it's scared.
Sorry, Johnny, just let me clarify something. That's an interesting point. Are you suggesting that we do need to know why it's scared?
Well, no, I don't know that. I'm saying, do you need to know why it's scared?
Okay.
Or do you just go, well, it's scared. It could be scared because of lots of things. It doesn't have to be scared because it's not being loved. It may be very loved, but something else, there could have been a trauma, there could have been something else in there. But do you need to know why it is scared, or just be able to communicate it with it as an adult to reassure that actually it's okay, but you don't know why it is as it is?
Well, look, I personally, I have to agree with you, because maybe the child doesn't know why it's scared, and if the child doesn't know why it's scared, you're not going to know why it's scared either. And also, it might be pre-verbal trauma, where you have absolutely no awareness of what actually occurred because of the trauma. And so, the child part will just wipe it out. And if you think about within the context of the child part, we have the baby, we have the toddler, we have the child, then we have the emerging teenager, then the teenager, the young adult or the emerging young adult, the young adult and the adult. And according to the American natives, and I've mentioned this before, the American natives are suggesting, people of the First Nation are suggesting, we only become adult by the time we get to age 40. So, our childhoods and our teenage years and our adult years, our young adult years are over a period of 40 years. So the point you're making, I think, is a valid point, because the child doesn't need to know, and we don't need to know either. All I know from my perspective, and I really can only talk from my perspective, I've got to give that child as much reassurance as I possibly can. And, please don't forget the kind of childhood I had. I was never reassured. My parents were always there, but they were absent. So even they were there physically, it doesn't mean that they were emotionally there. They were absent. And if they were absent, it would mean that I'm going to be absent. So there's something to be said about, discovering at the age of, I think it was about 32 or even 33, inner child work was, from my perspective, profoundly transformative. And, the start of an incredible journey.
I think it's important to note too, I mean, yes, everybody is different with this. And I don't think it's necessary that you know the specific cause as much as the emotional response. that tends to be habitual, and that's different for everybody. You know, I've heard over 30 years phenomenal stories of abuse. And I'm always amazed at the ability for human beings to normalize it.
Mm.
You hear these horrible stories and people will look up and go, well, didn't that happen to everyone? No, it didn't. It's unique to each of us. And the ability to survive the kind of trauma in some of the stories I've heard and assume that everyone else went through exactly the same thing is incredibly common and really gives people a measure of, you know, no, this really did have an impact, a damaging impact. It's very real. And today, as an adult, how will you soothe that child or adolescent who was wounded at that time? And
Is there a danger
always
from?
take a reaction. Go ahead.
Sorry, is there a danger? I mean, one of my closest friends years ago discovered through inner child work something that his mother did to him when he was very young, and he had it deeply locked away inside him, and he didn't know anything about it. When it came out, and actually through therapy it came out what his mother did to him, it was so traumatic. Was it best locked away? Because actually it's traumatized him for the last 15 years since it came out. So, you know, and I'm not saying that because you don't go and look at that, that it's obviously he was suffering already, but part of his subconscious had just gone, that was the most horrendous thing, aged 6 or whatever it is to happen to me. I don't want to deal with that. So, and now he's uncovered it. It's led to all sorts of things in his life.
Yeah, you know, that's a common enough dynamic not to make light of it. It's very serious. But that is how the trauma gets locked up in the body. The emotional response is largely triggered by the physicality of the trauma. You know, there's memes going around that, you know, the body keeps score, and it does. To have those emotions not dealt with and hidden away and suddenly revealed, it's not just an intellectual exercise. The body gets engaged and oftentimes will relive that trauma physically in the moment. Now, it's not true for everybody. Doing inner child work does not necessarily take such a dramatic turn, but it can. And largely because some of those big traumas get normalized and locked away in a locker someplace and come out at a later point. And we may understand intellectually, but physically, there's still energy to be released around that. I think more often than not, what I see is a sense of relief. There's this vague problem circling around, but you're not real clear about it. And to be able to go back and say, well, this is where that pattern first originated, and to feel it in your body. I oftentimes hear more relief at the clarity people gain rather than the terror over reliving the trauma, but both can happen. The biggest risk with trauma, like you described, is disassociation. Part of the way we normalize trauma like that is to disassociate. And so to feel that come back up in your body, the tendency is to disassociate like we did when we were younger, just to cope and survive. It's important to have very skilled guides or facilitators to actually drop down and be vulnerable enough to explore those places too. I liken it to a dive master on a boat for deep ocean dives. You want someone handy that knows you're going to get air and somewhat guide you through in extreme circumstances like that.
Yeah, there is something very important what you're saying, Snake, because the problem that you have, Johnny, if the unconscious releases that data, that information too quickly, it means that there's a whole collapse of the psyche. You know, when we talk about somebody having a nervous breakdown, underlying the nervous breakdown is the inability for the ego to actually embrace that. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done before information or data like that even comes to the surface. But as you probably already know, sometimes it can just pop up, and then it's years and years and years of therapy to integrate it, which is, you know, one of the problems. And I've worked with individuals just like that. It's taken years to integrate. Mark,
You know,
just holding a second, Snake. Mark, you got your hand up. Can we come back?
Yeah.
Get Snake finish what he has to say? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's very profound. You know, I desperately need relief. And you know, like Diala, I experienced infidelity, other aspects, violent abuse, etc. I think by locking it away and pretending these things have not occurred, I can see as I've got older and have not dealt with these aspects. I'm 56. My outlook on life and how I act in my life has got far worse. I can literally compartmentalize it almost by decade, and I'm, you know, for me the relief is now, you know, is now a desperate level, and I know a lot of this stuff now it goes, you know, way back to very young years right through to teenage years. So I can really resonate with the relief aspect. I just wanted to say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I was going to add, and it fits with what you're saying too, is some of the interpretation of my life is through the eyes of a child without full understanding, intellectual development or emotional development. An example I oftentimes use is I grew up in a real stoic Scandinavian family nobody ever touched. And so I grew up touch deprived, or at least that's how I understood it. And it made physical intimacy awkward for me. And the story that accompanied that for me was that I'd never been touched as a child. Later, come to find out and recall memories of my mother actually smoothing my hair or holding my hand across the street. I had been touched, but not in the parental loving sort of way that I longed for. Just understanding that I hadn't been neglected and had been touched, just not the way I'd set it up to meet my value system as an adult. I had that a little bit skewed and was able to better forgive my parents for what I considered neglect, realizing that I had been touched, just not in the way I yearned for. It can be as subtle as that, or reconciling trauma where there's physical or sexual abuse or so many things that really torment people. So there's a range to the benefit that comes out of the inner child work as well. I got clarity on something that I had maybe just 10 degrees off, but I'd created a story as an adult to support that and deepen it rather than truly understand it.
Very interesting how childhood trauma affects people in different ways, even though they went through the same thing. I've got two friends who've been sexually abused, one from a brother and one from a grandfather. And the one who was abused by the grandfather, abused as in like sleeping next to grandma and grandpa and being told to fondle and these things. She's grown up to absolutely be disgusted by sex. And this is a person who takes really good care of how she dresses, how she looks, spends money on her clothes. But when it comes to underwear, she would buy like the most nude thing or whatever. But what I'm interested in is how come others become more sexually active, and actually their whole identity becomes, oh, this is who I am. This is what I'm worth sexually. I don't know how to explain it, but it's just interesting why people become disgusted and others become more sexually active, more withdrawn, and more, I don't know.
I don't know. I have a good answer for that, but that is something I've observed as well. You know, some with that. And it's not just sexual. I see that again with anger or authoritarianism, or many of those, I don't know what to call them actually, those preferences that we run across like that. Is some react one way, some radically different. But I've acknowledged what you're saying. I've witnessed much the same thing with sexual abuse survivors. Some stay far away, others are doing something else with it, but very active.
That's interesting.
And I also, I don't think there's any specifically easy answer to that. I mean, when I think of the example you've given, and I think of some of the work of Daniel Goleman in his book Emotional Intelligence, where he talks about, I don't know if anyone's read the book, but there's a sequence, there's a section in the book where a school bus literally gets knocked off a bridge, and it's rolling down the hill, and eventually it stops. And there is one specific kid who was able to kind of just deal with the crisis and did what he could to pull kids out of the bus. I think the bus driver at that point was either deeply damaged or possibly even dead. But what was interesting in the story is that how could one kid, even though it was as traumatizing for him as it was for everyone else in the bus, was the one that was emotionally equipped to actually deal with this level of tragedy, whereas other kids were absolutely falling apart. And then the other component of this is how quick some kids recovered from that, and how other kids, it just shaped the rest of their life. And it's really difficult to answer that question. And I think there's a lot to do with emotional intelligence, a lot to do with IQ and EQ. Well, EQ as opposed to IQ.
What about resilience and caregiving and attachment?
Well, that would be certainly part of it. I mean, that's certainly part of emotional part of self-esteem is what you're talking about. And it might have been that this particular child had what you've just described, unconditional love, healthy attachment, etc.
I'd like to, I'm looking at the time, and I'd also like to bring another part of this. All the different places we've gone in this so far are certainly valid and important, but I really want to advocate for the benefits that don't sting out of this whole discovery. Claire spoke to spending time with her grandchildren. I do the same thing once a week. It's my equilibrium, if you will, to turn everything off and be a 3-year-old or a 7-year-old for a whole day. They get dropped off at 8 in the morning and get picked up at 6 at night. In between, I get to visit being a kid again. And what I find in that is joy and spontaneity and goofy, silly behavior. And I remember that from being a kid. And I'm able to capture some of it and carry it with me through the day. because truth is, I forgot. I got busy being serious as an adult and forgot how much joy there is in that childhood as well. And so it's not only looking at the root causes of our distress, but also reclaiming that part of childhood where we didn't carry all this baggage and wound, and bringing those pieces forward as well. My wife oftentimes comments how quickly I can become 3 years old. I love it. And, it's stress relief for me in many ways, to just be goofy and not have to make any apologies for it. I was an extraordinarily serious little kid. It wasn't until I was an adult that I felt free enough to be goofy. That's wrong. and many of us are brought up that way. The focus is on becoming an adult. I can hardly wait till I can drive. I can hardly wait till I can get out of my parents' house. We push adulthood so fast that a lot of the real benefit and joy of childhood gets lost. And that's a shame. It's important to do the work of recovering some of that. So it's not just what went wrong, it's trying to remember what went right.
I think this is one of the points that stand out for me based on what you're saying is the amount of people I've worked with who had to grow up too quickly, that they didn't really have the full length of their childhood. The death of a father, death of a mother, the family losing all their wealth, and how that shaped and impacted them. But I'm listening to you, and I certainly agree with what it is you're saying. And I don't know if anyone ever looks at Pinterest, but what's great about Pinterest, I mean, you can key in any subject, and there's hundreds of things that will come up. So I've just keyed in inner child work, and just to develop on what you're saying, one of the pages, and I'll send it to you, one of the pages that I found is the certificate of the inner child. So there is something about play which is fundamental to any child. And I'll just go through some of them for you and just see if you recognize any of these. One is to walk in the rain, jump into puddles of mud, collect rainbows, smell flowers, do bubbles, change your mind, to build sandcastles, walk backwards, admire the moon and the stars, say hello to everyone in the street, sing in the bath, read children's books, act crazy, play football with grandma, buy new sneakers, to walk hand in hand, to hug and kiss a tree, to speak with the animals, to play with the clouds, wonder about momsels. I don't know what that is. What is that, Snake? Wonder about momsels. Is that an American thing?
Say it again.
Wonder about momsels. Is that an Americanism?
Haven't a clue.
Okay.
I think it's African.
Oh, right. Okay. Make a drawing of something you've never seen. To take a little nap, be a hero, to keep a secret, to read a book under the blanket with a torch. I mean, that's really about entering the realms of that child part of us. So there is something to be said. People say to me, your work must be absolutely exhausting. There's nothing exhausting about my work. My work is inspirational. What's exhausting is the intensity and the seriousness. That's why the relationship that I'm in, the woman that I'm in relationship with, and I've been with for 12 years, one of the things that she does, she gives me permission to be as silly as I want to be. And she also makes me laugh a lot. She has this great sense of humor. But there's something really beautiful about the ability just to be spontaneous and as silly as I want to be without being judged or criticized.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that fits with, that whole notion of what does a child want, to be accepted in its entirety. And unfortunately, when we're children, that's where we begin deciding based on what other people tell us is appropriate or not. I mean, that's what I suffered in the adult. It was important to be a mini adult right from the very beginning. That was the ethic in our family.
But Snake, I also believe that's true for most people. that I certainly work with, they had to get too serious too young. So they kind of skipped a transitional process of individuation. And I don't know whether that's true for anybody here, but you know, I keep wanting to go back to the conversation that you brought to this forum, Diala, around the shame that you carry. And of course, my curiosity is that your shame or is that somebody else's shame? And I mean, I don't know what your answer is to that. But there is also something to be said about how we loved our parents and how we attached to our parents and how we took on our parents' suffering. And when I take on my parents' suffering, spontaneity is the first thing to take a vacation. And so it's about being able to challenge these unconscious agreements that we've made, let them go, and embrace certainly some of the spontaneity of what it means to be human and certainly what it means to be a child.
But also, you know, children can make up stories about what they think their parents' shame is, and they end up carrying it, a false narrative.
Yes.
What that is. So I think I'm carrying my mum's shame, but I think a year ago we had a conversation about something and I realized that she did not have the same interpretation about my father that I did. But for many years I carried that thinking that she thought that way. She didn't.
So that goes.
That's a good example of what we've been talking about sometimes we get things slightly skewed, and to understand that causes you to question, certainly, but it also offers an opportunity to rewrite that part of the story.
So then, Diala, it does, on some level, it does feel like it goes back to attachment theory. These unconscious vows that we make as a way of bonding, as a way of loving our people. And so the challenge is that if we've created that bond, that unconscious agreement, we can also uncreate it. Now, you know, you could say to me, what does that look like? That's a process. We certainly won't be doing that here. But the important thing is that I can uncreate the bond, or I can uncreate the unconscious agreement.
There's a certain discipline that I've learned that a way to identify this, we call it a tombstone. Oftentimes we carry a tombstone around, and it's an act of love, testament to some behavior in a parent one way or another. I know for myself, I carried my father's anger forward. My father was an angry, frustrated man. And I not only learned that from him, I built somewhat of a monument to that anger as being not virtuous, but worthy of note. And in the process, I somewhat merged with his anger. It wasn't really mine. It was a way of honoring him by carrying his behavior forward. And that's very common with parents, where we see one particular aspect of the behavior and create a monument to it, whether it's good or bad, whether it serves or doesn't. It's a way of loving them, and a dysfunctional way of loving them, but a way of loving them.
Yes, Johnny, I've just seen your poem. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they fuck you up in their turn by fools in old style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and a half at one another's throats. Man, hands of misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. So listen, folks, I'm aware we got 10 minutes to go. I did put up on the chat, you might want to download it. It's the certificate of childhood, or the inner child. You know, obviously read that in your own time, print it out and put on the wall, and, you know, reenact all those wonderful spontaneous activities and events. is there anything that we need to add, Snake, or has anybody got any questions that they might want to ask? Louisa, you got any questions you might want to ask?
To be honest, I don't. I'm a bit. I am a bit overflown with information that that has been set, and I fancy just, you know, reflecting on it. Really, I don't have burning questions.
Cool.
Thank you.
Any other comments, thoughts, feelings? Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I feel sort of bewildered, I guess. I feel like I've been hit with a number of things that I haven't actually thought about that have really go right to the core, I guess. I'm just trying to get a sense, how does this work as the program? And yeah, I'm sort of feeling anxious about it. Do I want to open this Pandora's lid, go on this journey? I think I need to, because the relief I know I desperately need. But can you help us understand how the program, you know, the structure of the program, Mike?
Well, which program we're talking about? The one in September?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I don't even know where to begin. We haven't developed it yet.
Okay.
Well, in fact, far from it. We haven't developed it at all. You know, Snake and I have had conversations, but closer to the time we'll certainly develop it, and we'll put that up there. But I just want to, when you spoke about program, I was just thinking about, you know, the program that we're delivering at the moment, because if you think about it from the perspective of the child part of you, you know, the child part of you is the part of you that acts their anger out uncontrollably. That's the part of you that is not able to discern. That is the part that is not open to self-discovery. And I'm talking about the wounded child, yeah? And that is also the part of you that is not able to be discreet or show any discretion, because that at that point, that's the part of you that's been triggered. That's the part of you that is acting your anger out. That's the part of you that's regressing. It's not the mature adult. You know, sorry, let me just turn this down. I've got one of those temperamental fans. A chap by the name of what was his name again? Fritz Perls. He said something very, very interesting. He said, what is the definition of an adult? And the answer to that is the ability to be able to embrace being alone. The ability to develop a healthy relationship with themselves, enjoy their own company. For me, the way that I understand that, that is the synthesis and the integration of the child part. So earlier on, you know, I was talking about this term synthesis, which is not a word that you and I used, Snake, but as we kind of got deeper into the conversation, I decided to look up the definition of synthesis, and it's in the chat, and this is it. The interaction or cooperation of two or more organizations, two or more parts, substances, or other agents to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their separate effects. For example, the synergy between an artist and a record company. So if you think about it from the perspective of the child part, it's the integration in the synthesis between the child part of me and the adult part of me. And remember when we started this conversation, I said to you, the child is the parent of the adult. The child is the parent of the adult. I mean, that is, for me, it's profound. And that is a comment, if I'm correct in saying, I think it was Aristotle, but it's been bastardized for Western language. And I have tried to find the original quote and I can't find it. But it's well over 2,000 years old.
Yeah, another bit here too. Pandora's box was mentioned. And, you know, a lot of information we touched in a lot of different areas. And I'll be honest, damn few people don't resist thinking, I'm not going to open that box, I'll never get it shut again. And only to open it up and discover, oh, I remember putting that in there. That feeling is a lot more having suppressed 30 or 40 years of who we are. It's all familiar once you unpack it. And so that fear around opening Pandora's box, I think, is universal. The quicker we get through that, the better, because whatever's in there, most likely you put it in there and decided it was too dangerous to let out and just packed it away. But as an adult, unpacking becomes more and more critical.
And for some of us, we don't really have a choice but to do that. But the analogy I'd like to share, Snake, for the Pandora's box. Somebody's arrived really late, just as we're about to finish. Christina, she's obviously got. Christina wasn't here earlier on, was she? No, I'm not going to let her in because we're coming to an end. So often in my programs, I hear people, and by the way, it's usually therapists. They usually say, I don't want to open that can of worms because I've dealt with it. Now, you see, if you've dealt with it, there isn't a can of worms. What I say is, the thing about worms, they fantastic protein. So, you know, protein is all about being nourishing. So the idea is that open the can of worms and eat the fucking damn things.
I like that.
But, I mean, it's, you know, for me, you know, it's a logical conclusion.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the more you repress it, the more depressed you become. Are there any other questions or comments, thoughts, or feelings before we start winding down?
I'd like to say something. I've never heard that expression, the tombstone, an act of love, testament of others. But as I was reading it, I just got this profound feeling, because when my father died, I got extremely angry. And when I look at it today, that anger was such a gift. And what I wrote here was a gift of anger from my dad. What a parting gift. Because I needed to activate that part of me that has been dormant for a long time. And just when you said the tombstone, an act of love, tells me that you carry something from your father, in your case, the anger. It just was like this flash in front of me. So thank you.
Oh, how interesting. Wow. Any other comments or questions, thoughts, feelings? Amanda, I thought you would have something to say.
Difficult day.
I'm sorry?
Bit of a difficult day for me.
Okay, I understand. So folks, we're at the end of our session. First of all, thank you all for being here. And even though there is only a handful of people, usually we always have half the amount of people that agree to come. You know, if you don't pay for it, you don't come, or you don't have to come. But we will put this out as a podcast. You can listen to it in your own time. I hope you don't mind becoming, I hope you don't mind 15 minutes of fame. You know, the famous saying by Andy Warhol. So without further ado, Snake.
Mike, I just want to say, Mike, can I just say, I just want to say thank you for you and Snake for doing these things. I think it's amazing what you're doing and opening it up to everyone. You know, I've listened to what a lot of people have said, and you know, I think it's a wonderful thing for people to come on and share, listen, learn, and it's, admirable, amazing, motivating, and humbling that you guys are doing this for everyone. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And
So
I learned what
funny.
my biggest desire is and what my biggest fear is as a child. So that was insightful.
It's an exercise that I'd encourage all of you to do. I mean, just do it privately and see where that takes you. I think you probably end up surprising yourself. But thanks everybody for joining us. Snake, as usual, thank you very much for your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Snake. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
So long.
Much
Thanks,
appreciated.
guys.
Be generous and forgiving.
That was Mike Fisher and Craig Snake Bloomstrand from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAAM for short, talking about listening to and mentoring the inner child. If you enjoyed beginning to get to know your inner child, remember you can join us in September for a special 4-part workshop on the subject. It's every Thursday evening in September, starting on the 9th, for 3 hours per session, starting at 7 p.m. And that's via Zoom, so you can do it wherever you are in the world. Head over to angermanage.co.uk to find out more about our special Mentoring the Inner Child workshop in September. We're back on July the 19th. The Wisdom Track podcast is back on July the 19th. That's a Monday night, where we're talking about the power of no. You can read Snake's thoughts on that thorny subject over on our blog at angermanage.co.uk, where you'll find plenty of other anger management related free resources. Thank you so much for joining us on the Wisdom Track. Please remember to smash that like button. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Buzzsprout, and YouTube. Or even better, please leave a comment, because those actions really do help us get the message out to people who need to hear it. Have a wonderful day, and we will hopefully see you again on July the 19th for the next Wisdom Track podcast. Until then, head over to angermanage.co.uk for lots more of this sort of thing. Have a wonderful day and see you soon.